Greetings and welcome to this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. My name is Joe Rubenstein and it is Wednesday, April 18th, and the Yankees got obliterated last night in the Bronx by the Miami Marlins. The final score was 9-1. I think that pretty much says it all, but of course I'll have a lot more to say. Not much of it very pretty. We got some tough love today, but that's how we roll here. We got to tell it like it is, right? You can follow us on Twitter, @BombersPodcast is the handle. You can also send us questions we'll try to answer each and every week in our mailbag segment here on the podcast. You can like us on Facebook, subscribe to our show on iTunes or Stitcher. You can also drop us a line if you want, 646-854-4959. And as always, you can send your comments and questions to joe@bronxbomberspodcast.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. Coming up a little bit later on here in our Twitter poll this week, some interesting results when we ask your level of confidence in Dellin Betances, and it's the definitive book on Jackie Robinson's first season in the majors opening day. And in honor of Jackie Robinson Day, which just passed, the author of that fine book, best-selling biographer Jonathan Eig, is going to join us once again on Bronx Bombers. You'll hear part one of that conversation. Also, I'll answer a fascinating question from one of our followers about the chances of a players' strike in Major League Baseball. And I'll recap the last week, which featured a mostly agonizing series in Boston, a win in Detroit, and an exchange of blowouts with the Miami Marlins here in the Bronx. We'll go through the good, the bad, and the ugly from these last few games. All that and more coming up on today's Bronx Bombers. Back in a moment.
Bronx Bombers Trivia. On August 25th, 2011, which of these four players joined Robinson Cano and Russell Martin in making the Yankees the first team to hit 3 grand slams in a single game? Was it A, Alex Rodriguez, B, Curtis Granderson, C, Mark Teixeira, or D, Nick Swisher? The answer coming up a little bit later in the podcast.
And now here's Joe with this week's main thing.
Well, it's not an isolated incident. It's actually a rather disturbing trend. And the Yankees seem to be engaging in a competition to come up with the worst, most dispiriting loss possible for their fans. Blown leads, they got it covered. And if that's not your cup of tea, how about an extra innings meltdown at home with a chance to win the game with the bases loaded and nobody out? End result, total failure. They got that down as well. Still not satisfied. How about a pair of annihilations at the hands of our worst enemy? But last night was truly special. It was last night's embarrassment, and it was beyond an embarrassment. It was actually a disgrace. But last night's game was pretty much an object lesson in how not to play baseball. The only suspense by the 7th inning or so was in how loud the boos would be when Stanton struck out again, and he did, again and again. Actually, no, there was one time he didn't. He decided to change things up. He hit into a rally-killing double play, so there's that. So right now, and you have no idea how much I hate to say this, and again, I know it's early, but right now, we are looking at a mediocre baseball team. They lead the league in errors. The pitching staff is on the bottom 5. Our hitters, with the notable exception of Aaron Judge, are incredibly streaky and prone to long cold spells, especially Mr. Stanton. But let's not forget Neil Walker, who's been absolutely invisible since he came to the Yankees. He's given us nothing. So the week began up in Boston with a mostly frustrating 3-game series played in truly miserable weather that featured 2 horrendous losses, which sandwiched a fight-filled win where we actually had to hang on for dear life at the end because our bullpen is not remotely reliable. Then a rainy weekend in Detroit where only 1 game could be played. That was a win, where again our bullpen made it way too interesting. This time Mr. Betances, who we'll get to later. And finally a couple of games here against the woeful Marlins. 2 blowouts, 1 in each direction. And to me, as of last night, Aaron Boone's honeymoon is over. Now, should he take the blame for the Yankees pitchers stinking up the joint game after game? I don't think so. Does he take the blame for some of our hitters, notably Mr. Stanton, remaining as cold as ice? Not really. Does he take the blame for the fact that we lead the league in errors and are playing horrendous fundamental baseball with base-running gaffes galore? Absolutely. These are things for which managers must be accountable. And if this level of disastrous play continues, I don't care how nice a guy he is, the media is going to be out for blood, especially because he's a rookie. And on that happy note, let's dive right into the good, the bad, and the ugly, as we take a hard look at some of the individual Yankee performances from this past week and assess what's gone right, what's gone wrong, and what's gone really wrong. But we begin with the good, and the headliner and sole member of this section this week has to be Mr. Aaron Judge, who, after a truly remarkable rookie season, is showing signs of improvement over that. Maybe even dramatic improvement. Judge right now is hitting .351, whereas last year at this time he was hitting .269. Right now his on-base percentage is an incredible .479, whereas last year it was .345. So as I predicted, we're seeing zero sophomore slump from Mr. Judge, just the opposite in fact. And the good news is we're seeing signs that Gary Sanchez, who just a week ago I was likening Gary's bat to a giant icicle, in just the past week, that icicle appears to have melted a bit. He did nothing last night, but still, he's boosted his average 100 points in just a week. His average in the 6 games since the Boston series began is about .350, and he's hitting for power, driving in about 10 runs in his last 5 games. And Aaron Hicks just came off the DL, is hot as well. Again, nothing last night, but 2 home runs against Detroit, including an inside the Parker, hitting .333 with an OPS over 1,200. But as far as the good, that's where it ends. Now, as far as the bad, other than the aforementioned players, the whole team has been bad. But let's focus on a few, starting with reliever Tommy Kahnle, who was a major bright spot in our bullpen last year after we acquired him from the White Sox, but is one of the guys who's really dragging down the pen. As far as runs allowed per game, our bullpen, which was supposed to be this huge strength, is now 7th worst in the majors. So Kahnle, along with Adam Warren, Chasen Shreve, and Betances, are not doing the job. Kahnle gave up 5 runs in the Yankees' 14-1 loss at Fenway. His ERA is at 6.14, and his velocity has apparently dipped. Last year it averaged 98.1, and this year it's about 94. Now, he was just put on the DL yesterday with tendinitis, so we'll see what happens with that. But he's been awful thus far this year. Really, the only reliable guys in our pen have been Robertson, Green, and Chapman. Also bad has been Tyler Wade, who, although he played well in spring training, may turn out to be a career minor leaguer. He wasn't hitting at all before he was essentially replaced by Ronald Torreyes. I mean, it's a patchwork infield right now with Drury and Bird injured. So for most of these games, we're seeing Wade at second and Andujar at third. Andujar hasn't been quite as bad as Wade. He connects. I mean, I must have seen Andujar hit 12 to 15 balls to the warning track this season. He did hit a home run last night for the sole Yankee run, his first of the season, but he has to boost his power just a bit more. And now, of course, the rumors are flying that Gleyber Torres, who coming off Tommy John surgery did not play well in spring training, but has since been lighting it up in AAA, that he could be promoted as soon as today or tomorrow. He's now eligible for the Yankees to promote him while gaining an extra year of control. So it could be that very soon we'll see a different infield in the Bronx. Torres in 10 games in AAA is 15 for 39, hitting .385. And although coming up with the Cubs he was a shortstop, he can also play second and third. Also bad has been Giancarlo Stanton. The reason why Giancarlo doesn't make my ugly section this week as he did last week is it's really a tale of 2 Giancarlos, on the road and at home. On the road, he showed definite signs of breaking out of his slump. On the road as a Yankee, Stanton is 10 for 31, so hitting .323 with 2 home runs, 7 RBIs, and 9 strikeouts. Not peak Stanton, but still quite good. At home, he's been an utter disaster. That's not hyperbole, that's a fact. 3 for 35, so that puts his average at 86. That's right, 086, with 1 home run, 3 RBIs, and 20 strikeouts. 20. So 57% of Giancarlo Stanton's at-bats at home have ended in strikeouts. Pathetic. And as I said last week, the fans will be merciless, and they have been. The boos have gotten louder and louder, and that will continue until he produces. Does he deserve, a grace period? Does he deserve, a fair shake with no boos? Maybe, but he's not going to get it. This is New York. And, considering the quality of competition we're about to face with some really good pitchers on Toronto and Minnesota, this could get a whole lot worse before it gets better, folks. Again, this is New York. You got to produce, especially when you take up a huge chunk of our payroll. Now, before we get to the ugly section, which today is headlined by Mr. Sonny Gray, one runner-up for my good section, and only a runner-up because his appearances have been so limited, is reliever Domingo Germán, who came in and mopped up for Gray after Sonny gave a truly atrocious performance in Boston. But Germán I like. He throws strikes, he doesn't get behind hitters, and he works quickly. So basically the opposite of Sonny Gray. And Sonny Gray so far this year has been absolutely awful. He's given us no length. The most innings he's been able to get through is 6 against Baltimore. In Toronto, 4, and Boston only 3. So Sonny's ERA now is 6.92. And the hope was when we gave up James Caprillion, Jorge Mateo, and Dustin Fowler for this guy, none of them, blue chip prospects to be sure, but the hope was that we were getting essentially a number 2 type starter. But he's looking like a number 5 starter, if that. He nibbles around the zone. Hitters, at least good hitters, are not falling for it, so he's constantly falling behind. And the pace that he pitches at is just, it's beyond slow. It's funereal. And, it drives everyone nuts, including, I'm sure, his outfielders. So there was a piece in the Daily News 2 days ago that said that pitching coach Larry Rothschild has been working with Sonny to correct a mechanical flaw, some sort of adjustment in his windup. So we'll see what the results are on Friday against Toronto. They don't have nearly the offensive firepower that Boston does. But even so, the Jays are 8-2 in their last 10 games and currently sit just 2.5 games out of first place. And we're 5.5 out, and we're about to tangle with 3 very tough teams, the much improved Minnesota Twins and Los Angeles Angels, both teams in first place as we speak, and the Angels leading the majors in pretty much every offensive category, and then the always tough Houston Astros, who came ever so close to being no-hit by the 44-year-old Bartolo Colon on Sunday night. I was so rooting for that to happen, but the big guy just ran out of gas at the end there. Still got the win, though. But just to wrap this up, I asked this question in January: can this team bear the burden of preseason expectations and play up to its potential, championship potential? And, my answer at the time, of course, was only time will tell. But within the limited sample size we've seen, 16 games, the answer is clearly a resounding no. That could definitely change, but I'm not going to sit here and lie and say that I like what I'm seeing in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I think it stinks. Back in a moment. We are joined this week once again by a special guest, Jonathan Eig, author of Opening Day, the story of Jackie Robinson's first season, about which Catherine Powers of the Boston Globe wrote, Eig investigates and sometimes debunks the iconic incidents of this nation-changing season, separating myth from fact. Jonathan has also written best-selling biographies of Muhammad Ali and Lou Gehrig. The latter we covered on an earlier podcast. Jonathan, it's great to have you with us again. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me on the show again.
Now, before we dive into the content of Opening Day, just tell us what it was that drew you to Jackie Robinson as a subject and inspired you to write this book.
Well, after my book on Gehrig, I loved working on the baseball story, and my publisher wanted me to do another one, but I didn't want to write a baseball book that was just baseball. Even the thing that made the Gehrig book so powerful for me was that it was really about a universal theme. It was about a man dying in his prime, and I wanted, if I was going to do another baseball story, I wanted to do something that had more to it than just the action on the field, and Jackie Robinson immediately came to mind. The Arnold Rampersad biography of Robinson was good and thorough. I didn't think that it was enough time had gone by to do a full-blown biography. A friend of mine suggested maybe doing a book on the friendship between Jackie and Pee Wee Reese. And I thought that was an interesting idea. I didn't know much about the relationship, but I called Rachel Robinson and I asked her what she thought about the idea of doing a book on Jackie and Pee Wee. And she got upset, actually. She really seemed angry at the suggestion that I made. And when I got her, calmed down enough, she explained that she really got tired of hearing people give Pee Wee all this credit as if Jack couldn't have done it by himself, and she always calls him Jack. And she said that season, that whole year really, Pee Wee was not friendly toward Jack, and nobody was really friendly toward him, and certainly none of the wives were friendly toward her. Nobody ever invited them home for dinner or out to the movies, and she felt like all year long that they could be sent packing at any moment. That if Robinson slumped, or if he got hurt, or if any of a million other things went wrong, their life was so tenuous that year. She said that they never even rented an apartment of their own. They just rented a room, paying month to month from a complete stranger. And it was, Jack and Rachel and their little baby living in a bedroom without even their own bathroom, without their own kitchen. And when she told me all that, I felt like I got hit in the head with a frying pan or something, like I'd been so stupid. I hadn't even thought about what that must have been like for them as a young couple, and the pressure that they must have been under together. And I thought, if I could dramatize that, if I could show just what it was like to be living on the edge that one season and how much it changed not just baseball but changed society, that would make a great little window into the world of Jackie Robinson. Without doing a full-blown biography, you could really tell the best part of his story. And that's where it began. It was that phone call with Rachel and her getting mad that really opened my eyes.
So before we get into the actual season, if you could just give us some background on the push for integration in baseball before 1947. What were the forces that were pushing for it to happen? What were the forces in baseball that were resisting it? And was there any support for it by white ball players and the general public?
There was not much support for it among white ball players, but there was some support for it outside the game and in society in general, and certainly among African Americans, but even among some more liberal and progressive and even communist white people. The big factor, I think, was World War II. Before World War II, nobody was putting up much of a fuss about the segregation of baseball. You had your Negro leagues, you had your white major leagues, and there was not much of an effort underway to try to do anything about that. And that began to change during World War II because African Americans were going over there and fighting and dying, and when they came back, there was the sense that another campaign needed to be launched. They called it the Double V campaign. We had victory in the war, and now we needed victory back home to fight for integration. And you began seeing African American newspapers in particular really spearhead a campaign. Let's get more of American institutions integrated. This is before Brown versus Board of Education. This is before Martin Luther King, and you started to see not just the black newspapers, but a lot of Communist Party newspapers and journalists, Communist Party leaders. And Communist Party was not so controversial. It was still controversial, but not as controversial as it would become in the 50s. And they started pushing for integration, and they went to baseball officials, and baseball officials were not exactly lining up to integrate. But Branch Rickey, who was in New York, of course, for the Brooklyn Dodgers, was getting pressure from a lot of different places. New York City was really the center of the progressive movement and the center of the Communist Socialist Party activity, and they were pushing political officials to take a stand on integrating baseball. Baseball was just seen as the kind of thing that could come first. If we integrated baseball, then we could talk about integrating other things like schools, like the military. A lot of people felt like baseball could drive that wedge and help open up other institutions. So Branch Rickey had the idea that this could be a good idea in a lot of ways. It could give him a competitive advantage, because if he was the first team to take on black players, he'd get the first shot at the talent pool that was available. He thought it might be good for attendance, for ticket sales, because a lot of African American fans would come out to the game. And he also thought it was the right thing to do. So Branch Rickey really deserves a lot of the credit for pushing when not really many others inside the organization of Major League Baseball were considering it even.
Now, in your book, you describe an incident that took place in 1944 after Jackie was drafted into the Army. This happened at Fort Hood in Texas on a bus, kind of a mini precursor in a way to Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, which would take place about a decade later, although the Jackie Robinson incident was much more spontaneous. Describe that incident for us, if you would.
Yeah, Robinson was on a bus. He was in the Army at the time, and he was ordered to move to the back of the bus and refused to do it. He was sitting next to a woman who, if I remember this correctly, the bus driver mistook for a white woman. She was actually light-skinned, African-American, and that may have aggravated the bus driver. But Robinson refused and faced a court-martial and actually went to trial and was exonerated. The charges were dropped, but if he had lost that case, he would have gone to prison. It certainly would have been a very different ending to the Jackie Robinson story.
Now, is this a story that Branch Rickey was aware of?
Oh, Branch Rickey was certainly aware of it. And that's one of the most interesting things about the selection of Jackie Robinson. You think about all the players that Branch Rickey had to choose from in the Negro Leagues. Robinson was not the most talented baseball player available. In fact, he was fairly unproven as a baseball player. He was much better known for his skills in football and basketball. He'd only just begun playing with the Kansas City Monarchs and was not the star of the team. And I think a big part of what attracted him for Branch Rickey was the fact that he was so courageous, the fact that he was so outspoken on race. And it's always occurred to me that, if I were the one making the choice, if I were the one hiring to integrate baseball, I might have played it safe. I might have picked a pitcher who would only be on the field once every 4 games. I might have picked a catcher who wouldn't be so visible. He's hidden behind a mask. And certainly Roy Campanella was talented enough that he might have been a good first choice. But Branch Rickey gets a lot of credit, deserves a lot of credit for picking an everyday player, picking a dark-skinned player who would be unmistakable out on the field, and picking somebody who was really a race man, somebody who was not going to take any crap. And Branch Rickey knew that this was a guy who refused to go to the back of the bus, that he was willing to face court-martial, and Branch Rickey wanted that kind of a strong, fearless guy, and that was a big risk in and of itself, but it set the right tone. I think it was really crucial.
So prior to playing for the Dodgers, Jackie was sent to the Montreal Royals in the International League, where he would be the first black minor leaguer in history. But his first stop was spring training in Daytona Beach, Florida. Now, you go into some detail in describing the harrowing trip with his wife Rachel from Los Angeles to Daytona Beach, a trip which began with Jackie's mother giving the young newlyweds a box of hard-boiled eggs and chicken to take with them. Tell us that story of Jackie and Rachel Robinson's journey into the Deep South, if you would.
Yeah, try to imagine that you're just married and you've taken this job that no one in the world has ever had before. A black man playing baseball in the all-white leagues. There's going to be 400 major leaguers, and you're going to be the only one who's African American. And you're heading to your first spring training with your wife. Most of the ball players were not allowed to bring their wives to spring training. Branch Rickey made an exception for Robinson, in part because he was going to be so all alone. He was going to be facing a lot of animosity, not clear whether his teammates were going to embrace him or not. And spring training happens to be in Florida, and not Miami, Florida, where there's some level of cultural sophistication and perhaps comfort with integration, but in towns where segregation is vivid and real and not to be messed with. So Robinson takes off on this journey with his mother's fried chicken and hard-boiled eggs, and his mother knows that this might be a difficult journey. That's why she insists on sending them off with food, even though it's a little embarrassing. But they take the food and they set out, and when they change planes in New Orleans, they're bumped from their flight, and Rachel and Jack absolutely believe that they're bumped for white passengers, and they're forced to then take a bus the rest of the way from New Orleans to Florida, and the humiliation of it was tremendous. I mean, Rachel, you could still see the anger boiling in her as she recounted this, almost 60 years later, telling me about how it felt to have to watch her husband accept these conditions, and for her to have to accept these conditions. And for Rachel, it was really the first time that she traveled in the South and seen these bathrooms marked whites only and colored only. This was a horrifying trip trip for them at a moment that should have been this great celebration. Their first shot at the major leagues and a chance to change the world.
Now, like many Major League Baseball teams at this time, the Dodgers had a distinctly Southern flavor. Their best hitter was outfielder Dixie Walker. They had a catcher named Bobby Bragan, both men from Alabama. There were a number of others. Talk about the team culture of the Brooklyn Dodgers in the mid-1940s.
It wasn't just the Dodgers. Baseball was really a Southern game in many ways. Phil Rizzuto told me that when he went into the Yankee clubhouse for the first time in New York, he felt uncomfortable because he was a city kid from the North. He was an immigrant. And there were all these Southern boys who talked about guns and fishing, and they were rough, tough guys, and he felt intimidated by that. So if this scrappy little Italian kid from New York, from New Jersey, feels intimidated by the Southern culture in the locker room, imagine how the first and only African American is going to feel. Dixie Walker, Bobby Bragan, all of these Southerners on the team were like existentially opposed to this idea of playing on an integrated team. I interviewed Bobby Bragan, and he said that he was a white supremacist. He believed that white people were superior genetically, culturally, intellectually, and he could not even imagine sharing a locker room, sharing a ball field with a black guy, and he worried about what was going to happen when he went home and had to tell his friends and neighbors and former schoolmates that he had played and shared a locker, shared a shower with a black man. He didn't really think he could do it, and he was willing to give up his baseball career to make the point. He signed the petition that a lot of the Dodgers signed, saying that they would sooner quit than play with Jackie Robinson.
And that was part of a general rebellion by some of the anti-Robinson Dodgers who were upset by his arrival. This took place in Cuba, where Rickey had decided to move Dodgers spring training. Tell us what you found out about this rebellion and what the response was, not only by Branch Rickey, but by manager Leo DeRocher, who was never particularly shy about expressing his opinions or his authority.
Yeah, we don't know if there was actually a written petition. No one's ever produced a copy of it, or if it was just a word of mouth. But ball players began to organize and saying, they can't start the season if we all refuse to play. And they basically came to an agreement that they would tell Branch Rickey that they refused to be on the team with Robinson, that it was either him or them. And when Leo DeRocher got word of it, and when Branch Rickey got word of it, DeRocher woke everybody up in the hotel and called them downstairs into the kitchen and just went crazy, cursed them all out, said, I don't care if he's black, white, or striped like a damn zebra. If he can play, he's going to be on this team. And anybody who can't handle that can take a walk. We don't need you. And he made it very clear that he was going to stand up for Jackie if nobody else, even if none of the other players were. And that really became a point of reckoning. These guys had to decide. They had to decide: are they prepared to give up their major league careers? The thing they've dreamed of all their life, to be a major league ball player. Were they prepared to give it up because of their principles, because of their racism? And they all ended up buckling. They all ended up sticking with the team. Nobody quit.
Now, Brooklyn in 1947 was this incredible convergence of ethnic groups, and Ebbets Field was sort of a representation in miniature of this melting pot. But as you point out, until Robinson arrived, black people generally made up only about 5% of the crowd there. Yet, on opening day 1947 against the Boston Braves, some estimates have the crowd as being 3/5 black. And there was a great deal of concern by a lot of people, black and white, that there would be incidents, fights, maybe even a riot. Talk about the efforts not only of Branch Rickey, but also within the black community, the black press, even the churches, to prevent this from happening.
Everybody knew how important this was. This was a tryout, not just for Jackie Robinson, but for African Americans everywhere who hoped to push for integration. So before the season even started, Branch Rickey began meeting with black leaders in New York, trying to get them on board, trying to remind them, it sounds patronizing, but trying to remind them that they needed to behave, that they needed to come to the ballpark sober and not look for trouble, and turn the other cheek if somebody yelled. And, of course, he said the same thing to Robinson, that you got to be able to take this abuse and not strike back, not lash out. But the black press and the black ministers in and around Brooklyn, they really picked up on this. And you'll see these newspaper editorials where black writers are basically treating their readers almost like children and saying, here's how to behave, here's how to carry yourself. Let's not make this job any harder for Jackie Robinson. He's got enough on his shoulders already. Let's not do anything to make it worse for him. And it was really impressive to see. And yeah, black fans came out from all over the country, everywhere the Dodgers traveled that year. Massive black crowds, more black faces than had ever shown up at these ballparks, and special train lines were running to the ballparks, special bus lines. Robinson became a huge hero among African Americans, and the Dodgers became their team. No matter where you lived, if you were African American, the Dodgers were your team in 1947.
That's Jonathan Eig. You've been listening to the first part of that conversation, and you can hear part 2 of that interview on the next episode of Bronx Bombers. Back in a moment.
And now the answer to today's Bronx Bombers trivia question. On August 25th, 2011, which player joined Robinson Cano and Russell Martin in making the Yankees the first team to hit 3 grand slams in a single game? The answer? B. Curtis Granderson. And now here's Joe with this week's Twitter poll.
Yes, this week's Twitter poll results are in. So just for some background, last Friday night in Detroit, Dellin Betances had another shaky outing, 5 hits, 3 runs before Boone finally pulled him and brought in Chad Green, who did well. And so I asked the following question in my Twitter poll on Saturday. After Betances' horrible outing last night, Boone said this, quote, "I know the result wasn't great for him, but I do feel like he's very close to where we need him to be, and will continue to put him out there because I think he's in a good place with his delivery. Even though it wasn't good, I think we'll get there," unquote. And so my question was, do you agree with Boone's remarks that Betances is close to being what he was 2 seasons ago or not? And 55% of our followers on Twitter at Bombers Podcast said no, they don't have faith in Betances, and 45% said yes. So there's 2 issues here. The first is what's actually happening with Betances, and the second is how he, Boone, and the Yankees organization are spinning what's happening. And to me, the remarks by Boone and Betances after some of these rough outings seem to have only a distant relationship to the truth. The fact is that Betances has proven time and time again that he is unreliable, and in my opinion, Boone left him in too long on Friday, far too long, in a game the Yankees absolutely had to have after losing 2 out of 3 real crushers in Boston. Even the win in Boston was closer than it needed to be, and this game in Detroit, which featured a nice bounce-back start by Jordan Montgomery, was a laugher that turned into a nail-biter. First of all, I thought Boone left Montgomery in too long, and look, my policy on criticizing bullpen moves is to only do it when I've disagreed with the decision at the time. That is before the result, not after. So this isn't really second-guessing, since I said at the time that Montgomery should be taken out after that first single by Castellanos, which turned into a run and then another run. And I said Betances should be taken out after the second hit off of him. You could see he was going to fall apart. And, check the timestamp on Twitter where I said it. It was before all the runs came in. The first hit off Betances, of course, was an absolute bomb off a first pitch fastball right down the middle of the plate to Candelario. So the structure of Betances' bad outings this year is slightly different from last year. He's not walking as many people, so that's good. And the reason for all the walks last year, of course, was horrendous fastball control. So the fastball location this year is slightly less terrible, but it still is not good. Many of them are just easy takes, nowhere near the zone, and the ones in the zone are being scorched. So what Betances is doing to counteract this, and you could see it happening on Friday, early on Sanchez was calling for the fastball, and it was either missing badly or getting mauled. So for the last 2 or 3 batters, Betances was shaking Sanchez off, and it eventually got to the point where he was throwing breaking stuff pretty much exclusively. Now he does have better control on his breaking pitches. The problem is, this is the major leagues, and players catch on incredibly fast if a pitcher is just doing one thing. So while Betances managed to get 2 strikeouts in the midst of this horrendous inning in Detroit, by the end of it, the Tigers were simply waiting for breaking pitches, knowing they were unlikely to see a fastball, and started just singling him to death. So Boone's remarks to me, again, bear little resemblance to reality. We've been hearing from Girardi and now Boone for over a year that he's close, right? I mean, he'll have one good outing and they'll sing his praises, and then 3 stinkers in a row and they'll say he's close. And they'll point to his strikeout totals. And yes, Betances this year does have 12 strikeouts in 6 2/3 innings. The problem is he also sports an ERA of 8.10 because most of the at-bats not ending in strikeouts are hits. And I said this on Twitter, he's almost the pitching equivalent of a hemophiliac. Hemophiliacs, once they start bleeding, they can't stop. And once Betances starts bleeding runs, it does not end until he is removed. And Boone was tardy, I thought, on pulling him, and I said so at the time. And frankly, some of Boone's other remarks afterwards to me were absurd. He said his pitches are crisp. Wonderful. That's good to know. Don't worry about the 5 hits and the 3 runs. His pitches are crisp. And Betances himself seems almost to be more removed from reality. It's almost as if after one of these outings, which are at this point too many to count, that a bad outing was the exception, not the rule. Betances said, quote, "It's not alarming. For me, it's about pounding the strike zone. That's what I need to do, and I feel like I'm doing pretty good at that right now. I feel good, so that's the important thing." So first of all, I'm glad he's not alarmed because every sentence I just quoted alarms me greatly. None of it bears any resemblance to reality. He's not pounding the strike zone. His fastballs are missing badly. And if all he can do is throw breaking stuff for strikes, again, hitters are going to pick up on that in 2 seconds as they did on Friday. And as far as him feeling good and that being the most important thing, it's nice that he feels good. I'm extremely happy for him. But actually, results are the most important thing here. And an 8.10 ERA, even this early in the season, is not a result to feel good about. And look, I've defended Betances. I did it on this podcast a couple of months ago when somebody asked me if he was the modern-day Mark Wohlers. My response was that it's too early to say, and I'm still not sure if that analogy holds, but what he is, and what he's been for some time now, is completely unreliable, mediocre, in fact. And as to why we're hearing about all the faith the Yankees have in him and what the real deal is behind Boone's, soft soap routine, I have no idea. Maybe Boone is just supporting his player, or maybe the Yankees are throwing him out there hoping to get some decent results so they can boost his trade value, which is not high right now, obviously. But I have to think that as far as Betances being a go-to guy in this pen, those days are numbered, and they should be. This pen has Robertson, Green, and Chapman, all of whom have pitched well this season, and Domingo Germán has looked good as well. So personally, I'm with the 55% that said no, I do not hold out a lot of hope as far as some resurgence for Betances. There have been so many breakdowns that it will take not 1, not 2, but at least 10 to 15 straight solid appearances before I hold out any hope. And frankly, I don't want to see him out there on the mound unless we're in a blowout situation. It's still early, but Boston's hot, and you don't want to fall 10 games behind. You just don't. All right, from this week's mailbag, our question of the week here on Bronx Bombers comes from Penny in Garden City. And by the way, the email is joe@bronxbomberspodcast.com, or you can find us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle, or leave us a message at 646-854-4959. If you have any questions you want to have us answer on any future episodes, we are more than happy to do so. And Penny writes, "This offseason, for the first time in years, I got nervous about a work stoppage in baseball. Do you think that could happen when the current collective bargaining agreement runs out?" Well, thanks for that question, Penny. It's a good one. And by the way, the current collective bargaining agreement runs out on December 1st, 2021. So there will be no stoppage for at least 4 years. And I don't think we'll see one again for a very long time, Penny. So I would rest easy. I think the damage from the 94 season being canceled, and of course the 95 season was abbreviated because of that strike as well. It was 144 games, not 162. But the damage was so great that the owners and the players are in no rush to walk down that road. And for those Yankee fans too young to remember, that strike was especially irritating because the Yankees were really firing on all cylinders in '94. We were in first place. Our final record before the stoppage was 70-43, 6.5 games out front of Baltimore. We were on pace to win 100 games for the first time since 1980. Jimmy Key was leading the majors with 17 wins in just 113 games. That's incredible. Paul O'Neill was unstoppable. No one could get him out. When the strike hit, Paul was hitting .359, which led the majors. So that was a bitter pill to swallow for Yankee fans, especially when you consider the possibility that Mattingly might have had his best shot at a World Series that year. And also, that was a great year in New York sports in general. The Rangers ended up winning the Stanley Cup that year. The Knicks made it to the championship round. So a lot was lost throughout baseball, but especially here in New York. And yes, Penny, it was a very strange offseason, no question about it. There were a lot of free agents unsigned with teams just sitting on their hands. But frankly, I don't see any collusion there. What I see is teams finally wising up. They've seen what happens with contracts like the Ellsbury contract, the Sandoval contract up in Boston, how these 9-figure multi-year deals with aging players can burn teams and burn them badly. And they're just not going to do it anymore. They've decided as businessmen that it doesn't make sense, and honestly, they're right. It is simply not an efficient way to build a roster for any team, but especially for small market teams. And if you look at the few big money contracts that were handed out this offseason, there are early signs that some of those might not work out as well. I mean, Yu Darvish is not pitching well in Chicago. Yes, about a strikeout per inning, but ERA at 6.0. He's 31 years of age. So that's a 6-year, $126 million deal that the Cubs could very well live to regret. Whereas, look at what the Angels did. I mean, they lucked out to an extent in that Shohei Ohtani wanted them as much as they wanted him, but, they're paying him practically nothing. They did have to send a $20 million posting fee to the Nippon Ham Fighters. That's Ohtani's former Japanese team. But look what they're getting. I mean, the Angels have essentially gotten two really good players for the price of one, a dynamite starting pitcher and a slugger. I mean, Ohtani is now 2-0 with a 2.08 ERA, 18 strikeouts in just 13 innings, and he's hitting .367 with 3 home runs and 11 RBIs. And when you look at the fan interest with the Angels' attendance just skyrocketing, merchandising, that's a major coup for the Angels. And, right here in New York, we're building from within as well to a large extent and getting tremendous production out of players like Judge, Sanchez, Severino, Chad Green for bargain basement prices here in the early stages of their careers. And you have a similar situation out in Houston. But the bottom line is, I don't know what the players can do about the fact that the business model in baseball is changing, and agents like Scott Boras are not going to be able to bamboozle owners for 9-figure deals anymore. I guess when the players are negotiating their next collective bargaining agreement, they can try to place restrictions on teams' ability to tank, to slash payroll by trading away stars for prospects like what the Marlins just did. But I don't see the owners caving, and if there is a strike, I think it would be very short-lived. It's tough to force business owners to accept restrictions that would kill their business. And, you might say, well, Joe, if the players strike, the owners don't have a business. Well, to that, I would respond, well, neither do the players. So just to put a bow on it, Penny, I think there will definitely be some tension, some acrimony during the negotiations a few years from now. The two sides definitely have a lot to work out, but I don't see a strike on the horizon. Both sides have too much to lose. I want to thank everybody for tuning in again this week here on Bronx Bombers. Again, don't forget, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. Follow us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle. Like us on Facebook as well. But most of all, have faith in the Yankees. We'll see you again next week.